Welcome. My name is Elaine Howard Ecklund, and I'm a professor of sociology and director of the Religion and Public Life program at Rice University in Houston, Texas. I'm also the author of Why Science and Faith Need Each Other, 8 Shared Values That Move Us Beyond Fear. Today, we're gathered for an online conference, How Science Can Strengthen the Faith of Your Church. This is sponsored by the Religion and Public Life program at Rice University and funded by a generous grant from the Templeton Religion Trust. This conference is expressly geared towards integrating Christian faith with science, but we are so honored to have all types of people here, and the broader work of the Religion and Public Life program at Rice University deals with various issues related to religion and public life from different faith perspectives and from the point of view of those with no faith. Many of you are aware that this conference was initially scheduled as an in-person conference at Rice University. I need to admit that I was so saddened when the in-person conference was canceled as a result of COVID-19 restrictions. But moving online has been redemptive. It's allowed us to expand greatly, growing 4 times our original planned size to the nearly 500 people who will be with us today at some point. This is a feat made possible in part through the hard work of our team at the Religion and Public Life program. Right now, I want to acknowledge in particular Haley Hemstreet, who has worked tirelessly alongside other members of the Religion and Public Life program to put this conference together. In fact, this is one of, if not the most diverse gathering we have had for a conversation around science and faith. We have people joining us today from many regions in the US and from most of the continents in the world, including those from the Philippines, from Vietnam, from Kenya, from Nigeria, from England, among many other nations. We have people from different occupations, including scientists, pastors, teachers, and many, many others. Thank you for joining us. I do not take the gift of your time lightly. We are in the midst of a global pandemic brought by COVID-19 and all the collateral, social, and economic suffering that has meant. And I and so many others walk with heavy hearts today, with grief and a sense of responsibility at the systemic racism in the US that is once again being exposed through the death of George Floyd. In all of this, discussions about science and faith can seem heady, irrelevant to many, a preserve of privilege, those who have resources to read books and ponder. But today, it's my hope that in our hours together, each of you will feel personally and practically engaged as we wrestle together with the ways that discussions about science and faith are deeply relevant to things like how we care for our youth and our young adults, how we address racial inequality and issues of justice, which several of our speakers will engage today. They are also relevant to how we build Christian communities that are truly engaged with the world around them and how we wrestle with the questions of what it means to be uniquely human. That's why I wrote Why Science and Faith Need Each Other, to be a practical resource to churches. I'm going to spend the next few minutes amplifying some of the pieces of why science and faith need each other that are most relevant to our conversation today. Fear. My conviction is that the tensions between faith and science often begin with unexamined fear. I'm going to read this story from page 13 of Why Science and Faith Need Each Other. The game is over. Come out now, or my mom will give you a spanking. There's no truth behind her threat, yet my 8-year-old daughter delivers it with incredible conviction. It had its origin several years earlier. She was 3 years old and I was picking her up from daycare. She begged to stay a few more minutes to play with her friends. I acquiesced. They started a game of hide and seek and I turned away for a minute. I expected that at any moment my daughter would sidle up to me and wrap her arms around my leg. After a few minutes, when that didn't happen, I started to look around. It's time to go, I called out. No response. I called again. I really mean it. It's time to go. Still nothing. I picked up my bag and walked over to where she and her friends had been playing, but I didn't see anyone. Where are you? I said, this time louder and more urgency, using her full name. Another parent came to help me look. Full-fledged anxiety set in, and my heart was beating quickly. I was now panicking. There were no sounds except my own voice. I checked up and down the street. The director of the daycare checked inside the center and its perimeter, and then activated the safety protocol for a missing child. In that moment, I truly believed that I might not find her. I felt fear like I never had before, and my fear motivated my actions. Where are you? I yelled at full capacity. From fear to anger. Suddenly, I felt a familiar touch on my right leg, and then a small voice said, Mommy, will I have my TV taken away tonight? I grabbed her and hugged her so tight that she asked me to loosen my grip. Even now, years later, my heart races as I read this. It was a little boy who found her. He told us he had heard her breathing and her giggle as she came near. The entire time I was searching, my daughter had been hiding within 10 feet of me. She had heard me. I let her down softly onto the sidewalk, then grabbed her arm up again and looked into her face, yelling, I'm so angry, I want to give you such a spanking. She started sobbing, as did the little boy who found her. Let's take a step back, the associate director of the daycare center said as she gently touched my arm. There is a fine line between fear and anger. I don't spank my daughter, and I did not then. But my fear, just so palpable minutes before, when I would have done literally anything to find her, had transitioned to anger, and the emotion took over. This experience taught me something. When I feel anger, the more true emotion is often fear. And so now I ask, what am I afraid of? I bring this lesson to my academic work on how Christians view science and the relationship between faith and science. Fear can masquerade as anger, leading to conflict. So when we see conflict between religious belief and science, we should examine whether there might be underlying fear. Is there fear that science might contradict or diminish elements of the faith? Fear about certain scientific findings and technologies that raise contentious ethical and theological questions? If Christians are responding to science based on fear, how might we assuage it or replace the emotion with other more productive habits or practices? Sociologists like me are interested in group behaviors. We're interested in how groups have an impact on individuals and how groups can bring changes to society for good and for bad. One way we study this is by listening to people's stories and analyzing to what extent these stories represent the groups individuals are part of. We understand our own story, I think, when we compare it with the stories of others even. Social scientific research and data also allow us to get past the loud, combative voices that often drive public debate and to gain a more nuanced and accurate picture of what people on the ground actually think, value, and believe. Sociology helps us to understand what group practices work best for what particular aims. For the past 15 years, I have been studying what religious believers think about science and what scientists think about religion. In total, I have surveyed nearly 41,000 religious believers and scientists on the relationship between faith and science. I've also conducted several thousand in-depth face-to-face interviews with religious people, with scientists, with religious scientists. My research shows that the views people hold about the relationship between faith and science are deeply relevant and practical. They can influence who people vote for, and by extension, the public financial support for scientific research. Views on the relationship between faith and science can also influence whether an individual goes to church and whether young people stay in church. There are Christian parents, for example, who worry about what scientists will say about faith when helping their children choose colleges and universities. Christians from the US and Black and Brown communities worry about being part of science and technology fields while not only their race and their ethnicity is underrepresented, but also their faith is underrepresented. Christian women and girls who want to pursue scientific careers wonder if they will be marginalized in their faith communities for their scientific aspirations and marginalized in their scientific communities for both their gender and their faith. Christians worry about certain medical technologies and research, whether they are ethical and whether they take into account the uniqueness of human beings and what it means to be made in the image of God. I hope that the conference today and my broader book will provide you with new ways of thinking about scientific issues and the relationship between faith and science. When I started writing Why Science and Faith Need Each Other, I found myself searching my house for a notebook from a philosophy class that I took more than 20 years ago as an undergraduate at Cornell University. In that class taught by Norman Kretzmann on the philosopher Thomas Aquinas, I first began to think deeply about Christian virtue, which Aquinas saw as practices or habits that tend toward the good. In studying, interviewing, and working with both Christians and scientists, it struck me that some of them seem to share virtues, things like curiosity, honesty, and humility. These are indeed some of the same virtues I have seen promoted and cultivated in faith communities around the country, including my own. I think I have a new approach to discussing the relationship between science and faith. I see science and faith not just as sets of ideas, but as groups of people. And I am convinced that some scientists and some Christians share common virtues and values that, if brought to light, will lead to common ground. My book explores 8 key virtues of faith: curiosity, doubt, humility, creativity, healing, awe, shalom, and gratitude, and how these virtues are practiced in the scientific and in the faith communities. The virtues of curiosity, doubt, humility, and creativity are crucial to the scientific process, and I argue ought to be a core part of Christian communities. The virtues of healing, awe, shalom, and gratitude reveal how science and faith come together in redemptive practices. I will talk briefly now about curiosity and shalom. First, curiosity. What does it mean to nurture curiosity? As a character trait, the philosopher Elias Baumgarten writes, curiosity is a disposition to want to know and learn more about a wide variety of things. The more one has this character trait, the more often or the more intensely one will, on particular occasions, experience a deep desire and urge to go investigate and learn about something. In our current culture, the word curious sometimes seems small and even weak. It brings to mind a child wondering what is around the corner before she tentatively takes a look. Our culture seemingly prefers stronger words like expert, leader, winner. We often want to be next to people who seem like they really know the whole truth. I see curiosity, though, as a deep show of strength, a yearning to push the boundaries of knowledge. And the most successful scientists report that they often had their curiosity nurtured from a very young age, often nurtured by their families and larger communities. For example, the string theorist Sylvester James Gates Jr., the first African American to have an endowed chair in physics at a major US research university, speaks publicly about the relationship between religion and science and about the importance of curiosity. Gates says that he got used to being curious at a very young age, not in his own, but because it was nurtured in his family. He says, I remember once I asked my dad, Dad, do you remember how when I was a kid, I used to ask all kinds of questions? And Dad said, yes, I remember. And I said to him, you always seem to have the answers for everything. And Dad looked at me and he said, what you don't remember, son, is that I didn't have the answers. But if I didn't know an answer, I would tell you to hold off and keep exploring. And I would go out and I would get some resources and we would talk about it. And the next day or so, I'd come back and try to answer your question. Even though no one in Gates's family or extended family was a scientist, his father created an environment that nurtured curiosity in Gates, and our world is the better for it. For some in the Christian community, curiosity can seem risky or scary. As a parent and a member of a church myself, I think about the kinds of questions about science and faith that my own daughter will have and about how they might impact her relationship with our faith. But I also realize just how important it is that we nurture curiosity as a virtue in our faith communities. In fact, Christianity calls on us to be curious. One of my favorite passages in the Bible is from the New Testament book of Philippians. Some of you know it. Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely or beautiful, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about these things. As Greg Kutsona from Chico State University, who we'll hear from later today, writes in his book, Mere Science and Christian Faith, whatever human knowledge discovers in nature, we are bound to listen, to learn, and to engage with it. Why? Because God has spoken and continues to speak through Scripture and through the natural world, through both words and works. We need to wrestle with what it means to nurture curiosity in our churches, curiosity about the natural world and about science. I want to turn next to Shalom and its implications for stewardship and justice. Shalom is a Hebrew word that comes from a root that means completeness and perfection. And it is the peace, the harmony, the well-being and prosperity that result from the flourishing of all creation. We do not usually think about it this way, but shalom can also mean to get involved in the messiness of the world, to try to mix it up with structures that are not just, to make them more just and more bent towards peace. In my interviews with scientists who are Christians, some of them said that they draw on the concepts of shalom and the related concept of stewardship to understand the importance and the meaning of their own work. Stewardship, or caring for the world in the form of environmental protection, is often thought of as something that's the domain of science, but it is also a deeply Christian virtue, a practice that brings us closer to God and to others. Christian stewardship encompasses the idea of human uniqueness, that we are created by God and thus have a responsibility to care for and look after the rest of God's creation, to steward it. One survey I conducted, I found that 28% of evangelical Christians and 31% of mainline Protestant Christians in the US said that they are very interested in caring for the environment, placing it above other kinds of social issues. But climate and environmental scientists have also told me that they sometimes meet Christians in the course of their work who are hesitant to discuss caring for the environment as a piece of Christian stewardship. Some Christians are even quite vocal against environmental efforts, worrying that placing so much emphasis on caring for the environment will lead us to neglect caring for humans or even take away our own resources. I've experienced these attitudes firsthand in the course of my research. One youth minister I interviewed, for example, said, if we have the opportunity, sure, we should help take care of this planet that we've been given. But having said that, I also believe the value of human life is much higher than the value of a whale or a species of monkey. Many Christian scientists, however, see environmental care and climate change research as tied to caring for people and a way we fulfill our responsibility as stewards of the earth. For these Christians, repairing and caring for the environment and addressing climate change is a way to show appreciation, respect, and reverence for God and all of His creation. For Christians, doing something about climate change, writes Catherine Hayhoe, a climate scientist and outspoken Christian, is about living our faith. It's about caring for those who need our help, our neighbors here at home or on the other side of the world, and taking responsibility for this planet that God created and entrusted to us, and taking care of the least of these. Seeking shalom also means being concerned about flourishing and justice for others beyond ourselves. The theologian Walter Brueggemann writes in The Prophetic Imagination, Jesus, in his solidarity with the marginal ones, is moved to compassion. Compassion constitutes a radical form of criticism, for it announces that the hurt is to be taken seriously, that the hurt is not to be accepted as normal and natural, but is abnormal and unacceptable, an unacceptable condition for humanness. Thus, the compassion of Jesus is not to be understood as only a personal, emotional reaction, but it is to be understood as a public criticism in which he dared to act upon his concern against the entire numbness of the social context. Some of the scientists who are Christians that I interviewed explicitly discussed with me the importance of increasing representation and equality in science as one of their goals and one of the ways that they enter into Shalom, that they make the world of science more bent towards peace, that they seek the flourishing of all humanity through their work as scientists. Some of these scientists said that they connected their faith specifically to increasing opportunities for those who are now underrepresented in science. Studying and increasing diversity in science is an area that I am particularly passionate about as well. Some of those I interviewed for my studies join me in this. For example, when we look at the US scientific community, we see that non-whites, but especially Black Americans and Hispanic Americans, are vastly underrepresented in science. For example, Black Americans, who comprise from 12 to 15% of the US population, make up just less than 1% of all those who have careers in science, medicine, or technology. And women of all racial and ethnic groups are also underrepresented in the basic scientists. While women represent more than 50% of the overall US population, they are less than 10% in many scientific fields. Yet, African Americans, Latinx people, and women are all overrepresented in Christian faith. Nearly 80% of Black Americans see themselves as committed Christians, and 77% of Hispanics see themselves as Catholics, Protestants, or evangelical Christians as well. I want to take a moment now to recognize that part of the problem is that science does not feel safe for everyone. David Unander, a professor of biology whose work examines race and racism, writes that by the late 1800s, evolution was a metaphor for eugenics, a program to eliminate those seen as inferior within European nations, linking science to ideas about racial hierarchy. In Black and Hispanic communities, harboring suspicion towards science and towards medicine can be well-founded then, can be part of a community of memory, where even if an individual has not herself been experienced marginalization or discrimination at the hands of science, she remembers that her ancestors, her grandparents have experienced these things. Abuses like the Tuskegee syphilis trials. Nothing about the descriptive process of evolution supports racism or eugenics per se, but perversion continues to have an impact on perceptions of science among members of color and Christian communities who have well-founded fears that some aspects of science and medicine may actually be used as a tool to diminish their humanity. Another reason people of color are underrepresented in science is that they are more likely to be in poor, under-resourced schools with poor science education. A related problem is that Christians from Black and Hispanic faith communities in particular don't hear about scientists who believe like them or see scientists who look like them. One Christian geneticist I met, who's one of the few Black women in her field in an elite university, said that during the 5 years she spent as a graduate student, there was only one Black speaker brought in for her department's weekly seminar out of the nearly 250 speakers they had. And for a lot of African Americans, science seems like a no trespassing zone, one Black pastor told me. I do think it's helpful, a Hispanic pastor I interviewed said, to have somebody of your own skin color in science, because to see one of your own gives a kind of inspiration. Representation matters, and the lack of representation of women, minorities, and Christians in science is an issue that ought to concern the church. Churches need to ensure that Black and Brown students have access to science resources and that their voices are included in their dialogues on science and faith. If you look at the faith-science conversation in particular, it's mainly white people, an Asian evangelical Christian biologist told me. In his view, we need to engage the entire church in the United States on faith and science issues. How we engage on faith and science really does include Black churches and Hispanic churches and Asian churches, and their experiences are different and they have different questions, and so we need to ask them and include them. And he told me, I think it's really striking if there's any resistance to that. This evangelical Christian biologist also told me that his focus on the virtues underlying stewardship and shalom have helped him connect with many of his non-religious colleagues in science, particularly other scientists of color. He said, they stand on common ground in what they hope their work will accomplish. Thank you. I hope you will read Why Science and Faith Need Each Other. I hope you'll help me get the word out about the book by posting a review about it on Amazon. And more important, I hope you'll enjoy today's conference and be deeply challenged by it. So one question, thanks for putting this together. Blessings to all during these challenging times, our questioner says. How did you get the idea for this conference and who has been involved? I think our team got the idea for this conference really through the course of the research studies that we've been doing in faith communities over the past 15 years. And as we looked at all of those studies, we started to realize that certain kinds of Christian communities are the ones in recent years that have been bringing questions to the table of science. Questions about concerns about medical technologies, of course, concerns about evolution and the impact it has on faith and Christian understanding. And we thought, let's do a conference that's specifically geared towards answering those kinds of questions, towards wrestling with those questions together. Another question, this one comes from a professor at Catholic University. Can you speak to the role of politics in the faith-science interface? People of faith who think about environmentalism is a liberal agenda led by the likes of Al Gore, former vice president. Is some of the fear of science driven by political allegiances? That's a fantastic question. We think in particular of environmentalism and climate change as two of the issues where politics may be an important driver alongside faith, and for climate change, perhaps even more of a driver than faith, politics, where people start to align their faith and their politics with opposing what they see as a certain kind of scientific agenda. So for those scientists who are Christians, many of whom have great concern about lessening the effects of climate change, my advice to them is to try deeply in the kind of rhetoric that you use, in the conversations that you have, to separate politics and faith yourself. I call it the Al Gore effect. In some ways, we want this to be seen much more as an issue of stewardship than as an area of politics. Another question, the speaker says, thank you for this discussion. Can you talk about how you selected the 8 values? Those who are theologians or ethicists or experts on virtue among us, I'm sure there are some, will say, wait, but there's so many other virtues. There are so many other things that faith and science might hold in common. These particular values and virtues, the 8 that I chose, are ones that I see coming up most often as shared virtues between the scientific community and the faith community. It's certainly not an exhaustive list, but I wanted to keep it a relatively short list because I'm hoping that the book will be used for things like 8-week discussion groups in science communities or science and faith discussions or in churches. So I wanted to keep the list short, and these are the ones that I notice coming up more often. You mentioned that women, says the speaker, African Americans and Latinx communities are underrepresented in the religion and science dialogue? What work is being done to include these persons in the dialogue? That is an excellent question, especially right now. I want to walk humbly here and say there is not enough work being done. But I do think, just as one of our most well-known scientists in the faith community, Francis Collins, who's current director of the NIH, said that he's personally going to stop speaking on what he calls manels, where it's a panel of men scientists talking about a topic. He wants these panels to be more inclusive and include women as well. I think those of us scientists who are white need to be pursuing diversity in extraordinary ways. We need to be challenging the kinds of racist structures that are in science that keep underrepresented minorities out of science. And so I think more of us need to stop placing the onus on our brothers and sisters of color to solve these problems, but start stepping up and start refusing positions of power that aren't inclusive. There's so much more to be said. That's just a small response, but that's a kind of question most of us need to keep asking. This is a listener tuning in from Palo Alto. I wanted to ask if you can recommend how Christian scientists in training, undergraduates, grad students, postdocs can be better engaged to bring diversity into the field. I think this starts really, really young. So I want to see us worrying about diversity and equity in science education from the very earliest years of science education. I am part of a ministry in Houston called the Summer Institute, which I'm particularly proud of, where we are doing wraparound education for kids in middle school age, where they are tracked from 6th and 7th and 8th grade and given high quality science education over the summer for the same cohort of students, and then helped to apply to high school and even helped all the way through college. So I think it's almost too late to start asking these questions when we get to the stage of full-fledged scientists. We need to be thinking about issues of equity in science very early on in science education. But I so deeply appreciate the question asked by the listener. And I want all of us to be asking that question, to be looking for scientists who are out there, people of color who have important life experiences and perspectives to bring to the conversation, and sometimes to make sure wherever possible that we can make sure those voices are represented. I really appreciate that question. A question from the UK, the University of Oxford. The questioner says, how have your empirical findings varied in different parts of the world, especially in lower and middle income countries? That's a fantastic question. In one of the studies that our team has done, we have looked at scientists, biologists, and physicists in 8 different regional and national contexts, and found that in some of the poorer countries where there's not as much scientific infrastructure, that questions about science and faith in particular remains what I called before that kind of preserve of the privilege. These are not first line kinds of questions. People are asking questions like, how can we get more monetary resources to build scientific infrastructure? But as I hope we talk about today, I think that there can be a real place to wrestle with faith and science questions as very, very deeply practical questions, is providing a kind of moral framework for people to fight for equity and more resources in science. This is a great question. So a questioner from our own Houston has asked, how has your research on science and faith changed you as a person? That's such a good question. I came to this research on science and faith, and particularly my research on what scientists think about faith, with a deep conviction as a sociologist of religion that there are many, many different ways of being a person of faith and being a scientist. But I would say that when it came to thinking about atheist scientists, I didn't have a terribly nuanced view. I actually thought that there's probably one way of being an atheist scientist: you just don't believe in God. And my research has really changed me, and I think it's changed other members of our team as well. where we now see that there are also many different ways of being an atheist and a scientist. And one of our future books is going to deal with that topic, in particular, varieties of atheism in science. I also think that the research has really changed me and my faith as a Christian. It's been deeply motivating to understand that the scientists who are persons of faith have a kind of humility about them, which I have learned from in very sincere ways, that we don't always have to know the answers to questions, that it's okay to wait and to let the questioner really wrestle. And I think that's something that these studies over the years have made me wrestle with more deeply. Another question: what kinds of diversity that are being talked about in Christian communities? Often it focuses on race, which is an enormous issue, but I often wonder about research on sex and gender and how Christian communities are responding to that. We have just merely hit the tip of the iceberg there. There is so much needed discussion on issues of gender and sex. And we want our church communities to be places where the scientific research on sex and gender is really openly discussed, where there is not fear, where there is space made for honest discussion and struggle. And I think sadly that we're not doing enough there, and that we need to be doing so much more. Someone from Butte College asks, how would you define scientific authority? Some who are skeptical of science point out that expertise is often incorrect, and those who speak for science are sometimes more certain than evidence warrants. That is a wonderful, wonderful question. Some of our research on evangelical Christians in the US in particular shows that Christian communities rather, have a great deal of trust in science. And I think that comes as a surprise. I talk about this quite a bit in Why Science and Faith Need Each Other, that Christians are actually really supportive and trusting of science. But I think, as the questioner is pointing out underneath that question, they're sometimes mistrusting of scientists who they see as overstepping their bounds, especially when it comes to issues of ethics, the moral implication of human reproductive genetic technologies, other types of science that seem to have implications for the uniqueness of humans and what it means to be made in the image of God. And so they see them as sort of creeping into areas of knowledge and expertise. This is an area where the virtue of humility, I think, becomes incredibly important.